For many Americans, Venezuela has long been viewed as a tragic but distant story. A country rich in resources, poor in outcomes. A cautionary tale of economic mismanagement and political decay, but not something that directly threatens the United States. That perception is understandable, and it is also deeply outdated. Under Nicolás Maduro, Venezuela stopped being just a failed state. It became a strategic liability in one of the most sensitive regions of the world, the Western Hemisphere. And that is precisely why Washington eventually concluded that Maduro's Venezuela was no longer tolerable from a geopolitical standpoint. This is not primarily a story about ideology. It is not simply about socialism versus capitalism. It is a story about power, energy, influence, and geography, and how economic collapse can turn a nation into a weapon inside a global competition. To understand why Maduro's Venezuela is so dangerous to U.S. geopolitics, we must move beyond slogans and look at structure. 1. Geography alone makes Venezuela strategically sensitive. Venezuela sits just a few hours by air from the United States. It borders key Latin American countries and lies adjacent to critical maritime routes in the Caribbean. In geopolitical terms, this matters enormously. For over a century, the United States has viewed stability in the Western Hemisphere as a core national interest, not because of ideology, but because proximity amplifies risk. Instability close to home has consequences that instability on the other side of the world does not. A hostile or dysfunctional state in South America is not just a regional issue. It becomes a platform for rival powers, illicit networks, and economic disruption. Maduro's Venezuela evolved into exactly that kind of platform. 2. Oil turns Venezuela from a failed state into a strategic threat. Venezuela holds the largest proven oil reserves on Earth, more than Saudi Arabia. On paper, that alone makes it one of the most important energy countries in the world. But under Maduro, Venezuela's oil industry collapsed. Production fell dramatically. Infrastructure decayed. Skilled labor fled. Investment vanished. What remained was a paradox: immense energy wealth controlled by a regime incapable of managing it. From a U.S. geopolitical perspective, this is extremely dangerous. Oil is not just a commodity, it is a strategic input that shapes inflation, military logistics, trade balances, and global power. When a country with enormous oil reserves becomes dysfunctional, it creates a vacuum. And in geopolitics, vacuums do not stay empty. 3. Venezuela became an entry point for U.S. rivals. As Venezuela collapsed economically, it did not become neutral. It became dependent, and dependency always invites influence. China stepped in with loans, oil for debt agreements, and infrastructure projects. Russia provided military cooperation, intelligence support, and diplomatic protection. Iran used Venezuelan channels to bypass sanctions and move energy products. From Washington's point of view, this was a red line. The United States can tolerate ideological disagreement. It can tolerate poor governance. What it cannot tolerate is a strategic foothold for rival powers inside its own hemisphere, anchored in energy, finance, and security cooperation. Maduro's Venezuela was no longer just unstable. It was aligned against U.S. interests in a way that compounded every other risk. 4. Economic collapse creates security threats, not just poverty. One of the most misunderstood aspects of Venezuela's crisis is the belief that it is purely humanitarian. In reality, economic collapse has direct security implications. As the Venezuelan state weakened, criminal organizations expanded. Drug trafficking networks embedded themselves within state structures. Smuggling routes multiplied. Informal economies replaced formal ones. This matters to the United States because these networks do not stay contained. They move money, drugs, weapons, and people across borders. When criminal power merges with state power, the threat becomes systemic. From a geopolitical perspective, a state that cannot control its own territory, economy, or institutions becomes a transnational risk exporter. Maduro's Venezuela exported instability. 5. Migration as a geopolitical shockwave. Venezuela produced one of the largest migration crises in modern history. Millions fled the country, straining neighboring states and reshaping regional politics. Mass migration is not just a social issue. It is a geopolitical one. It destabilizes allies. It fuels political polarization. It creates diplomatic tension. It forces neighboring governments to make security, budgetary, and humanitarian trade-offs. For the United States, Venezuela's collapse added pressure to an already fragile regional migration system. This turned Venezuela from a distant failure into a persistent hemispheric stressor. 6. Sanctions. Failed to change the strategic equation. For years, the U.S. relied on sanctions to contain Venezuela. The logic was straightforward: restrict revenue, isolate the regime, and force change. Economically, sanctions reduced cash flow. Geopolitically, they failed to resolve the core problem. Why? Because sanctions freeze dysfunction. They do not fix it. Maduro adapted. Informal markets expanded. Rival powers filled the gap. The population suffered while the strategic alignment remained unchanged. At some point, Washington concluded that containment without resolution was worse than escalation. A permanently dysfunctional, hostile, oil-rich state was more dangerous than confrontation. 7. Energy security is national security. For American audiences, especially those who lived through inflationary cycles and energy crises, this point matters deeply. Energy supply affects prices, retirement savings, national defense, and economic stability. When energy markets are tight, geopolitical leverage increases. Venezuela's oil reserves, if functional, could stabilize markets. If controlled by hostile actors, they could destabilize them. From Washington's perspective, allowing a collapsed petrostate to remain aligned with rivals was a long-term strategic risk. This is why Venezuela moved from being a foreign policy issue to a national security concern. 8. Maduro's Venezuela undermined regional order. The Western Hemisphere relies on a basic assumption: states may disagree, but they remain functional. Venezuela broke that assumption. A collapsed economy, politicized institutions, criminalized governance, and foreign alignment against the U.S. combined into a destabilizing force. This weakened regional cooperation. It forced neighbors to hedge. It invited extra-hemispheric powers to intervene. Geopolitically, Venezuela became a stress fracture in the regional system. 9. The signal to the world matters. How the United States responds to crises near its borders sends signals globally. If the U.S. tolerates permanent dysfunction aligned with rivals in its own hemisphere, it weakens deterrence elsewhere. Allies doubt resolve. Competitors test limits. From Washington's strategic viewpoint, allowing Maduro's Venezuela to persist indefinitely was not neutral. It was permissive. That perception mattered far beyond Latin America. 10. The core lesson: economic failure is never isolated. Maduro's Venezuela teaches a hard geopolitical truth. Economic collapse is not contained by borders. When a state collapses economically, crime expands, migration increases, rival powers intervene, strategic assets become weapons. Instability spreads outward. This is why the U.S. ultimately viewed Venezuela not as a domestic tragedy, but as a geopolitical threat. Conclusion. Maduro's Venezuela was dangerous to the geopolitics of the United States, not because of rhetoric, but because of structure. It combined strategic geography, massive energy reserves, economic collapse, criminalized governance, rival power alignment. That combination is intolerable in any region, and especially intolerable in the Western Hemisphere. This was not about punishing Venezuela. It was about containing instability. It was about energy security. It was about geopolitical balance. And above all, it was about recognizing that economic dysfunction, when left unresolved, becomes a strategic weapon. That is the lesson Venezuela offers, not just to the United States, but to the world.